you can feel it, the moment the noise stopped, without your permission.
Not outside, inside.
And the unsettling part is how ordinary everything looks while something in you has clearly changed.
It's like you're living in the same life, but the watcher isn't sitting in the same seat anymore. You didn't lose interest. You didn't give up. You didn't become numb. You just stopped hovering over reality like it was about to prove something. And lately, it's been unusually quiet. You might not say this out loud to anyone, but the word has crossed your mind, Arcturians. Not as a fantasy, not as a belief you're trying to force, more like a label your nervous system recognizes. The way you recognize a name you haven't heard in years, but it still lands somewhere familiar. Because what you're experiencing doesn't feel like a mood, it feels like a phase ending. Here's what makes this specific. When a phase ends, there's usually a visible result, a reward, a sign, a moment you can point to. But this one ended the opposite way. It ended by removing something, a constant internal pressure, a constant scanning, a constant sense that you needed to stay on the edge of your own life, watching. And now that it's gone, you can feel the space it used to occupy. That's why it feels quiet. Not because nothing is happening, because something stopped happening. You were in the observer phase for longer than you realized. You watched your emotions from a distance. You watched your reality for patterns. You watched timing and meaning and synchronicity, and the way people shifted around you. Even when you were living, you were also monitoring, and it didn't feel unhealthy. It felt intelligent. It felt like survival with better vocabulary. But something has changed. You're not trying to decode every moment anymore. You're not leaning forward, asking life to show its hand. You still notice things. You still feel things. But the part of you that used to sit back and evaluate everything has gone quiet. And when that part goes quiet, reality can feel unfamiliar for a while, because you're no longer getting the constant feedback of your own interpretation. This is the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you missed something, like, did I do something wrong? Did I fall off my path? Did I lose my spark? But the deeper truth is more subtle. You didn't fall off anything. You stopped standing outside of it. And yes, this is where the word returns again almost on its own. Arcturians. Not as a lecture, not as a story, as a signature. Because the shift doesn't feel like motivation. It doesn't feel like healing. It feels like a clean conclusion. A loop closed so gently that your mind didn't even catch the moment it happened. You may notice that your environment has become quieter too, not literally, but people don't pull the same reactions from you. Drama doesn't hook into you as easily. Old triggers still exist, but they don't complete the circuit the way they used to. Something in you refuses to fully engage with what once consumed your attention, and that can feel like loss, until you realize it's relief. There's a strange calm in the middle of your days now, a calm that isn't trying to become anything, and it can feel almost suspicious, because you got used to inner tension, meaning you were doing it right. You got used to the feeling of effort, meaning you were aligned with your path. But what if effort was part of the observer phase? What if the watching was only needed for a chapter, and now the chapter is over? Somewhere around this point, you might start noticing a new kind of silence. Not silence as emptiness, silence as after. Like the room after a conversation ends, like the stillness after a storm passes, like the air after something finishes burning. The sound is gone, but the warmth is still there. And if you're listening closely, there's a message in that quiet that never uses words. It just says, you don't have to stand guard anymore. There's more to what ended than you can name right now. And you don't have to name it yet. But by the time we reach the later layers of this, you'll recognize why the silence feels so intentional. After the silence settled, you may have noticed something else. Your attention no longer rushes ahead of the moment, not because you're trying to stay present, not because you trained yourself to slow down. It just doesn't surge forward the way it used to. There's no constant leaning into the future, no internal voice asking what this will lead to. The moment arrives and it's enough on its own. This is usually when people say things like, I feel strangely neutral lately, but neutrality isn't quite right. Neutrality suggests distance. What you're experiencing is closeness without tension. You're here, fully, without hovering above your life like it needs supervision. When the Arcturians are mentioned in the transcripts you saw, it's never dramatic. It's not about intervention. It's not about being chosen. It's about phases of perception. And right now, the perceptual stance you lived in for a long time has quietly ended. The stance of watching yourself live. Think back. There was a period where you were constantly aware of being aware. You tracked your reactions. You evaluated your emotions. You noticed patterns, timing, reflections. Even joy came with commentary. It felt advanced. It felt necessary. And during that phase it was, but that kind of awareness has a cost. It keeps you slightly outside the experience, safe, alert, but never fully resting inside what's happening. And now, that layer has thinned, not because you failed it, because it completed. The Arcturians don't appear here as characters. They appear as a marker, a way to name the moment when the observer role is no longer required. When the system you are using to interface with reality shuts itself down, cleanly. No crash, no announcement, just quiet. You may have felt this most clearly when something happened that should have triggered you, and it didn't. The thought started, then lost momentum. The emotions surfaced, then dissolved before turning into a story. Not suppression, completion. This is when time starts to feel different. Not slower, not faster, less segmented. Moments don't feel like steps towards something else anymore. They feel like standalone points of experience, whole. You're not disengaged from life. Life no longer needs to be monitored. This shift can feel unsettling at first, because the observer phase made you feel safe. Watching felt like control. Interpreting felt like intelligence. Letting go of that stance can feel like stepping into open space without armor. But notice this. Nothing rushed in to harm you. Reality didn't collapse. It simply continued, without the extra layer. There's also a quiet confidence emerging here. Not confidence in outcomes, confidence in timing. You don't feel the need to force decisions. Choices appear when they're needed and vanish when they're not. No internal debate required. This is often where people ask themselves silently, is this it? Not in disappointment, in disbelief. Because the quiet doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with normal days that feel lighter, less loaded. And again, the word may surface without effort. Arcturians. Not because you're being contacted, but because the framework matches the sensation. A non-dramatic transition, a role retired, an observer stepping out of the room. You're not missing a next step. You're living after a step that took years to complete, and the mind takes time to adjust to that. There's more beneath this quiet than you can feel right now, not louder, deeper. We'll move closer to that layer soon, not by explaining it, but by letting the recognition catch up to itself. At first, the quiet may have felt unfamiliar, not peaceful, not uncomfortable, just unoccupied, like a room after furniture has been moved out, but before anything new is brought in. Your mind might have tried to re-engage, to ask questions, to reassert control, but the questions didn't gain traction. They rose and fell back into the silence. This is usually when people assume something is missing, a drive, a purpose, a sense of direction. But what's actually missing is the need to orient yourself from the outside. The observer isn't gone because something failed. The observer stepped aside because something stabilized. When the Arcturians are referenced in the material you're familiar with, they aren't framed as rescuers or guides. They're associated with non-interference once alignment is reached. Not alignment as a goal. Alignment as a state where monitoring becomes redundant. And redundancy always leads to quiet. You may notice that effort now feels strangely loud. Trying too hard disrupts the calm instead of producing results. Pushing feels unnecessary. Overthinking feels abrasive. Not because those behaviors are wrong, but because they belong to a different internal configuration. This is where many people feel slightly disoriented, because the absence of struggle can feel like loss. Struggle used to signal engagement. Intensity used to mean you were on track. Now engagement feels subtle, and subtlety doesn't announce itself. Here's a gentle internal reorientation. You're not drifting. You're no longer bracing. There's also a shift in how you relate to meaning. You're less inclined to ask what something means, not because you stopped caring, because experience no longer needs translation to feel valid. Moments don't arrive as symbols. They arrive as themselves. This can feel anticlimactic, especially if you spent years expecting a moment of realization to feel dramatic. But completion rarely feels dramatic. It feels quiet, unceremonious, almost private. You may have noticed that your sense of identity has softened, not disappeared. Softened. You still know your preferences, your boundaries, your values, but you don't defend them the same way. You don't rehearse who you are internally. You simply respond, and that response feels sufficient. This is often when the idea of parallel versions of self stops feeling abstract, not because you see alternatives, but because you no longer feel pulled between them. The version you're inhabiting feels settled, not superior, not final, just coherent. And again, the reference to Arcturians fits here not as an explanation, but as a contextual echo, a way to say this phase was always meant to end quietly, without validation, without confirmation, without spectacle. There's a moment, small, almost invisible, when you realize you're no longer waiting for permission to relax into your own life. You don't announce that moment. You notice it later, by the absence of tension. What comes next doesn't arrive as a new chapter. It arrives as a different way of standing inside the same reality. We'll touch that layer later, when the stillness feels familiar enough to notice what's underneath it. There's a subtle shift that happens after the observer phase ends. Reality starts to feel cleaner, not easier, not softer, cleaner, as if the extra layer of interpretation that once wrapped around every experience has quietly fallen away. You still think, you still reflect. But the constant inner narration, the voice that used to explain everything to itself, doesn't dominate the space anymore. This is where many people notice a strange contrast. Life keeps moving, events still unfold, yet internally there's less friction, less resistance, less need to position yourself against what's happening. It's not resignation, it's cooperation without effort. When the Arcturians are mentioned in the transcripts, it's often alongside this exact sensation, not contact, not messages, but a post-observer state, a state where perception no longer needs to prove it's awake, because awareness has stabilized. You may notice this most clearly in ordinary moments. A conversation ends and you don't replay it. A decision is made and you don't second-guess it. A feeling passes through and you don't analyze its origin. Things happen and then they finish. That's new. Before, nothing really finished. Experiences lingered in your mind long after they ended. They turned into stories, lessons, signals. Now experiences complete themselves. They arrive, they exist, they leave. And the space they leave behind doesn't demand to be filled. You're not disengaged, you're uninterrupted. This uninterrupted quality can feel unfamiliar, because interruption used to feel like participation. Thinking about something felt like being involved with it. Now, involvement doesn't require mental looping. Presence does the job on its own. There's also a shift in how reflection works. Reflection used to be active, intentional, almost strategic. Now it's passive. Insights surface when they're ready and dissolve when they're done. You don't hold on to them. They don't need to be stored. This is often when people start to feel slightly invisible, not to others, to themselves. The identity that once narrated your journey isn't as loud. You're still here, but you're not constantly announcing yourself internally. And that can feel oddly peaceful. The Arcturians in this context are not something you reach toward. They represent a completed interface, a way of interacting with reality that was useful until it wasn't needed anymore. Once the interface shuts down, silence follows, not as loss, as efficiency. You may notice that your relationship with effort has changed. Effort still exists, but it's no longer your default state. When effort appears, it feels specific, purposeful, not chronic, not constant. There's a calm certainty that begins to form here. Not certainty about outcomes, certainty about where you're standing. You don't feel the need to justify your pace. You're no longer measuring progress against invisible timelines. Time feels less like pressure, more like a medium you move through. And if there's a sense that this quiet has a collective quality, that others somewhere are experiencing something similar, you don't need to trace that thought yet. It's enough to notice that the silence doesn't feel personal. It feels shared. There's a moment when you realize something subtle. You're no longer checking yourself, not checking your state, not checking your alignment, not checking whether you're doing this right. That habit faded so quietly you might not have noticed when it stopped, but now when you look for it, it isn't there. This is where the quiet takes on a different quality. It's no longer just silence. It's absence of supervision. The inner sense that someone needed to be on duty, tracking, interpreting, adjusting, has dissolved, and what's left feels surprisingly stable. In the material that mentions the Arcturians, this is often the point being touched without ceremony. Not a beginning, not an activation, a handoff, where the role of observer is no longer required because the system can run without being watched. You might notice that awareness now feels wider, but less focused, not scattered, open. You're not zoomed in on yourself anymore. You're simply here, inside experience instead of hovering above it. This can create an odd sensation at first, as if something important should be happening, but isn't. As if you're waiting for a cue that never comes. And then slowly you realize the cue already happened, and it wasn't loud enough for the mind to register. Here's a gentle internal reset to let land. You're not waiting for the next phase. You're living after one concluded. This is often when people feel strangely uninterested in explanations. Not resistant, just done. Theories feel flat. Frameworks feel repetitive. Even ideas that once fascinated you don't grip the same way. Not because they're wrong, because you no longer need scaffolding to hold your experience together. The mention of Arcturians here isn't about authority, it's about timing, a reference point for a transition that happens when observation becomes unnecessary. When awareness no longer needs to reflect on itself to stay awake, you may notice that decisions arise more cleanly now. Less debate, less internal negotiation. Choices don't feel heavy, they feel obvious, not because they're easy, but because there's no internal resistance pulling against them. There's also a soft emotional neutrality that settles in. Not numbness, not detachment, a steady baseline. Emotions still come and go, but they don't define the moment they pass through. They don't linger. They don't demand interpretation. This is where many people quietly worry they've become too calm, as if calmness were a warning sign. But the calm you're experiencing isn't suppression, it's completion. The observer phase required tension, attention stretched outward, awareness constantly scanning. The phase after does not. It rests. If you sit with this long enough, you may notice something unexpected. You feel more real now, not heightened, not special, real, grounded inside your own experience without narrating it. And if the word Arcturians surfaces again in your mind, it doesn't arrive as curiosity, it arrives as recognition, like a familiar symbol for a process that already finished doing its work. There's one more layer beneath this calm, not dramatic, not hidden, just quieter than the mind is used to listening for. We'll approach it next, slowly, without naming it. There's a point where you notice effort doesn't do what it used to. You can still apply it, you can still push, but the response is different now. Effort feels loud, almost out of place, like speaking too forcefully in a room that's already quiet. This is subtle but important. Before, effort created motion. Trying harder felt like progress. Now effort feels like friction, not because you're incapable, but because movement no longer comes from pressure. It comes from alignment, and alignment doesn't announce itself. In the Arcturian framing that appears in the transcripts, this is where the shift becomes obvious without explanation. The system doesn't respond to force anymore. It responds to resonance, not belief, not intention. Resonance. When something matches, it moves. When it doesn't, it stalls, quietly. You may have noticed this in small ways. You try to revive an old ambition, and it feels hollow. You push toward a familiar goal, and there's no momentum. But then something unexpected presents itself, and there's movement without effort. No internal debate, no preparation, just action that feels obvious. Here's a gentle reorientation to let pass through. You're not losing drive. Drive is no longer the engine. This can feel destabilizing at first, because drive once defined your identity. You knew who you were by what you pursued, by what you were willing to endure. When that changes, the mind looks for replacement meaning. But nothing rushes in to fill the space, and that's intentional. The observer phase required constant calibration. Am I aligned? Am I off track? Am I missing something? Those questions had energy because observation was still active. Now, those questions don't generate charge. They arise and fall flat. The Arcturians aren't described as guiding you here. They're associated with withdrawal. not abandonment, completion, a presence that no longer needs to stay present once stability is reached. When monitoring ends, silence follows. This is often where time starts behaving differently again, not just flatter, more forgiving. Deadlines don't carry the same weight. Waiting doesn't feel like delay. Moments arrive when they arrive, and somehow that feels sufficient. You might notice that you're less interested in optimizing yourself. Improvement feels optional, not because you've peaked, but because you're no longer defined by becoming. You're defined by coherence. Here's another internal reset, quiet and brief. Nothing needs to be fixed for movement to happen now. This doesn't mean life becomes passive. It becomes responsive. You act when there's alignment. You pause when there isn't. No guilt attached to either. That's new. There's also less attachment to outcomes, not indifference, clarity. You can see where something is going without needing to control the path. And if it doesn't go anywhere, you let it dissolve. No story required. This is where many people feel an unexpected sense of trust, not in the universe, not in a system, in timing, your own. If the word Arcturians still resonates here, it's not because you're waiting for something from them. It's because the silence they're associated with matches what you're living. A silence that doesn't ask for attention. A silence that exists because nothing is missing. There are only a few layers left now. Not because we're reaching an end, but because there's less to peel away. What remains doesn't need explanation. It only needs space. There's a moment when you realize this silence isn't isolating. At first it feels private, almost too internal to mention, but then you notice something subtle. Others don't pull you the way they used to. Not because you're withdrawn, but because you're no longer seeking confirmation through them. And strangely, that creates more room for real connection. Less performance, less positioning, just presence meeting presence. This is where the quiet takes on a collective texture, not a movement, not an agreement, more like a low hum beneath everything. You sense that this isn't happening only to you. That many people in different lives are experiencing the same drop in internal noise, without language for it. In the Arcturian framing, this is where individuality doesn't disappear, it stabilizes. When the observer phase ends in enough people, the collective field softens. Not visibly, not dramatically, but interactions lose some of their sharp edges. Conflict doesn't hook as deeply. Urgency doesn't spread as easily. Something calms underneath the surface. You may notice this in simple exchanges. Someone speaks and you don't rush to interpret. You listen, and that's enough. You respond without rehearsing, without adjusting yourself mid-sentence, and afterward, there's no replay. The moment completes. Here's a gentle internal reset to notice. You're not protecting your energy anymore. You're simply not leaking it. This can feel unfamiliar if you're used to vigilance, if awareness once meant guarding yourself. Now, awareness feels like openness without exposure. You're not braced, you're not armored, and yet, nothing invades. This is often when the idea of path changes. You're no longer tracking progress along a line. The sense of direction feels internal and immediate. You know what fits, you know what doesn't, and you don't need reasons to justify either. The mention of Arcturians here isn't about hierarchy, it's about resolution, a point where observation as a survival strategy is no longer necessary because the environment you're in now matches you. When mismatch ends, vigilance ends. You may notice that your relationship with the past has softened. Memories don't pull as strongly. Regrets don't replay with the same charge. Not because you resolved them, because you're no longer standing in the same perceptual position that created them. This is where awareness begins to feel self-sustaining. It doesn't require reminders. It doesn't need maintenance, it's just there, quiet, stable. There's one final recognition that tends to arrive late in this process, not as an insight, but as a settling. When it lands, the quiet stops feeling new and starts feeling familiar. We'll approach that gently next. At some point, you stop noticing the quiet, not because it fades, but because it becomes the baseline. It no longer contrasts with noise. It doesn't stand out. It simply holds everything. This is where recognition settles in, without a thought attached to it. You're not waiting anymore. Not for a sign, not for confirmation, not for the next phase. The sense of after is complete. When the Arcturians are mentioned at this point in the transcripts, it isn't to point forward. It's to mark closure, a signal that the observer phase, The long period of watching, interpreting, standing slightly outside your own life has ended. Not temporarily, cleanly. What remains doesn't feel spiritual. It doesn't feel elevated. It feels ordinary in a way that's hard to describe. You make coffee, you answer messages, you move through your day. And beneath all of it, there's no commentary asking if this is meaningful. It simply is. Here's a final, gentle internal reorientation to let pass through. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to happen next. This doesn't create stagnation. Movement still happens, but it comes from fit, not force, from resonance, not effort. When something belongs, it moves. When it doesn't, it dissolves without conflict. There's often a quiet gratitude here, not directed at anyone, not even named. Just a sense that you no longer need to hold yourself together through vigilance. The structure holds itself now. If the word Arcturians still carries weight for you, it does so without mythology. It marks the end of supervision, the moment when observation was no longer required to remain conscious, when awareness learned to rest inside itself. The strange thing is, nothing looks different from the outside. No one applauds. No threshold appears. Life continues, and that's the point. The conversation doesn't end here. Not because there's more to explain, but because what you're experiencing doesn't conclude. It continues quietly, inside ordinary moments, in pauses, in ease, in the absence of tension. You didn't receive something, you completed something, and completion doesn't need to announce itself. It just leaves behind space, and that space is where you are now.